For nearly 700 years, Japan was ruled not by emperors or politicians, but by men who lived and died by the sword, samurai who believed honor mattered more than life itself. They were warriors, judges, and kings in armor. But on one battlefield, surrounded by gunfire, smoke, and betrayal, the age of the samurai did not fade quietly into history. It was violently torn apart, proving that tradition alone could not survive the modern world. The battle that ended samurai rule in Japan was not just a clash of armies, it was the death of an entire way of life. For centuries, the samurai class dominated Japan's political and military system, serving powerful feudal lords known as daimyo under the authority of the Tokugawa shogunate. This system brought stability after years of civil war, but it also locked Japan into rigid traditions. Samurai trained from childhood in swordsmanship, archery, and discipline, following the code of Bushido, which demanded absolute loyalty, courage, and an honorable death over surrender. However, by the mid-19th century, the world around Japan was changing fast. Western powers arrived with steamships, cannons, and modern rifles, forcing Japan to open its borders after centuries of isolation. The Tokugawa shogunate struggled to respond, and pressure grew from reformers who believed Japan must modernize or be destroyed. In 1868, this tension exploded into the Boshin War, a civil war that pitted the old samurai-led shogunate against imperial forces loyal to Emperor Meiji. The imperial side promised modernization, central power, and a new Japan modeled after Western nations. Many samurai resisted fiercely, believing modernization was a betrayal of their identity and honor. Although the imperial forces eventually won, the victory did not end resistance. Displaced samurai lost their privileges, stipends, and social status. They were forbidden from carrying swords in public, the very symbol of their class. For warriors raised to believe they were Japan's backbone, this humiliation was unbearable. Among them was Saig Takamori, once a hero of the imperial cause, now disillusioned with the government he helped create. Saig believed the Meiji leaders had abandoned traditional values in their rush to copy the West. As resentment spread, southern Japan became a hotbed of rebellion, setting the stage for the final and most dramatic stand of the samurai. By 1877, open rebellion erupted in Kyushu, led by Saig Takamori and thousands of former samurai in what became known as the Satsuma Rebellion. These men were not criminals or rebels by nature, they were veterans, aristocrats of the battlefield, many of whom had once fought for the emperor himself. But now they marched against the very government they helped install. Armed mostly with swords, old rifles, and fierce determination, the samurai faced an imperial army trained in Western tactics and equipped with modern firearms and artillery. The contrast could not have been more symbolic. On one side stood centuries of tradition, personal combat, and honor-bound warfare. On the other stood conscription, uniforms, machine-like discipline, and industrial firepower. The imperial army was made up largely of commoners, farmers, and laborers, trained quickly but efficiently to fight as modern soldiers. For the first time in Japanese history, samurai were fighting against an army that did not fear them. Early skirmishes showed the samurai still possessed unmatched courage and skill in close combat, charging enemy lines under heavy fire, cutting down soldiers with terrifying precision. Yet bravery could not stop bullets. Every charge cost them irreplaceable lives, while the imperial army could replenish its ranks endlessly. As months dragged on, the rebellion weakened. Ammunition ran low, supplies vanished. The samurai were slowly hunted, surrounded, and crushed by superior numbers and firepower. The final stand came at Shiroyama, overlooking the city of Kagoshima. Fewer than 500 samurai remained, wounded, starving, and hopelessly outmatched. They knew there would be no victory, no retreat, and no mercy. At dawn, imperial artillery thundered into the hills, tearing apart defenses that swords could not protect. When the shells stopped, imperial troops advanced, rifles blazing. What followed was not a battle in the traditional sense, it was an execution. Samurai charged one last time, many wielding broken swords or fighting with bare hands. Saig Takamori was mortally wounded and, according to legend, committed seppuku to preserve his honor before dying. By the end of the day, the last organized samurai force in Japan had been annihilated. The battlefield was silent, but an era had ended forever. The aftermath of the battle reshaped Japan in ways no one could reverse. With the defeat of the Satsuma Rebellion, the samurai class ceased to exist as a political and military force. The Meiji government moved quickly to solidify its power, expanding compulsory military service and building a national army modeled after European powers. Japan's future would belong not to hereditary warriors, but to citizens trained as soldiers of the state. Swords were replaced by rifles, clan loyalty by nationalism, and personal honor by obedience to central authority. Yet the samurai were not erased from memory. Their values were carefully repackaged and absorbed into Japan's modern identity. Bushido was transformed into a moral philosophy taught in schools and used to promote loyalty to the the emperor. Samurai imagery lived on in propaganda, literature, and later military culture, even as the class itself vanished. The irony was striking. The government destroyed the samurai in reality but preserved them as a symbol. The battle that ended samurai rule was not simply a military defeat, it was proof that tradition, no matter how powerful, cannot survive unchanged in a modern world. Japan emerged from this conflict stronger, unified, and rapidly industrialized, soon defeating major world powers in the decades that followed. But that success came at a cost, the loss of a warrior class that had shaped Japan for centuries. On the slopes of Shiroyama, beneath the smoke and blood, the samurai did not just lose a war, they lost their place in history. And with their fall, Japan stepped fully into the modern age, leaving behind the echo of clashing swords for the thunder of guns. Yet even as Japan marched confidently into the modern age, the shadow of the samurai never truly disappeared. Former warriors were forced to reinvent themselves as teachers, bureaucrats, businessmen, and officers in the new imperial army, carrying fragments of their old identity into unfamiliar roles. Many struggled deeply with the loss of status and purpose, haunted by the feeling that the world no longer needed men like them. Stories spread of ex-samurai who could not adapt, who drank themselves into obscurity or lived in quiet bitterness, watching a society they once ruled move forward without them. At the same time, Japan's leadership carefully reshaped the samurai legacy into something useful for the state. The discipline, loyalty, and willingness to die for a higher cause, once pledged to a feudal lord, were redirected toward the emperor and the nation itself. In this way, the spirit of the samurai survived, not as an independent class, but as an ideological weapon. This transformation would have profound consequences in the decades ahead, influencing Japan's military culture during its imperial expansion and later conflicts. The irony remained painful and unavoidable. The samurai had lost everything so that Japan could gain everything. Their swords were banned, their privileges erased, and their social order dismantled, yet their ideals were immortalized and demanded from future generations. The battlefield of Shiroyama thus became more than the site of a final massacre. It became a symbol of transition, marking the moment when Japan chose survival through change over loyalty to the past. The age of individual warriors ended there, replaced by mass armies, factories, and a centralized state capable of standing shoulder to shoulder with the world's great powers. But beneath the uniforms and modern weapons, the memory of the samurai endured, echoing through Japanese history as a reminder that progress often demands sacrifice, and that the end of an era is rarely quiet, clean, or merciful.